The 12 curiosities about Solomon's temple. 27 tons of pure gold on the walls, 400-ton stones moved without machines, and an impossible rule, building in absolute silence. Solomon's temple was not just a religious building, it was the most expensive and technologically advanced work of the ancient world. And here's what nobody tells you. Modern engineers look at the numbers and can't explain how that was possible 3,000 years ago. Have you ever wondered how 150,000 men coordinated a construction of this magnitude without modern communication? Or how they transported gigantic blocks through mountains using only ropes and wooden logs? In this video, you'll discover 12 impressive curiosities about Solomon's temple that will completely change your perspective on ancient engineering and faith. These are details that most people have never heard of, but which reveal the true miracle behind this legendary construction. Get ready to learn about the secrets of the quarries, the brutal transportation techniques that killed dozens of workers, the stone marking system that made each block unique, and how a mysterious cloud filled the temple on inauguration day. If you want to understand how the impossible became reality and what that means for you today, stay until the end. Because this isn't just an ancient story, it's a lesson about determination, purpose, and greatness that can transform how you see your own challenges. Curiosity. 1. The construction took exactly 7 years, not 1 day more. When Solomon began the temple construction, he wasn't just doing an architectural project. He was fulfilling a divine promise made to his father, David. And there was a deadline. 7 years. There was no margin for error, no schedule extension. The temple needed to be ready in the 11th year of Solomon's reign, in the 8th month. According to 1 Kings chapter 6 verses 1 and 38, construction began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, in the month of Ziv, which corresponds to the 2nd month of the Hebrew calendar. It finished in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, the 8th month, exactly 7 years later. Think about what this means. We're talking about 2,555 days of coordinated work, involving 150,000 workers spread across different locations, quarries in the mountains, forests in Lebanon, metalworking workshops, and the main construction site in Jerusalem. Each stage depended on the other. A delay at any point could compromise the entire project, but there was no delay. And this didn't happen by luck. Solomon set up a military supervision system. There were 3,300 supervisors controlling every detail, every worker, every task. Above them, 550 chief officers who answered directly to the king. It was a rigid hierarchy, where each man knew exactly what to do and when to do it. The Israelites worked in rotating shifts. 1 month in the forests of Lebanon, 2 months at home. This kept the workforce constantly renewed, avoiding complete exhaustion. The Canaanites, subjected to forced labor, didn't have this alternation. They worked continuously until the work's completion. And here's the impressive detail. In 7 years of uninterrupted construction, there were no major revolts, no wars that diverted resources, no devastating plagues. The project flowed from start to finish like a perfectly oiled machine. When the last stone was placed, when the last gold plate was fixed, the temple was exactly as Solomon had planned, on schedule, without failures. Curiosity 2, 150,000 simultaneous workers. The magnitude of Solomon's temple cannot be understood without understanding the workforce necessary to erect it. We're not talking about hundreds or a few thousand men. We're talking about 150,000 workers working simultaneously on different work fronts. According to 1 Kings chapter 5, the division was clear. 70,000 carriers, men whose only function was to transport material. Stones from quarries to Jerusalem, wood from ports to the construction site. They pulled ropes, repositioned logs used as rollers, slept beside the loads. It was the most brutal, most dangerous work, and the one that killed the most. 80,000 stone cutters worked in quarries scattered through the mountains around Jerusalem. They woke before dawn, walked to extraction sites, and spent the day splitting rocks using ancestral techniques. They inserted wooden wedges into fissures, poured water, waited for the wood to swell and the pressure to crack the stone, without explosives, without the noise of metal tools. 10,000 workers in Lebanon. Israelites sent in rotating shifts to work in the cedar forests. 1 month cutting centuries-old trees alongside specialized Sidonian lumberjacks, 2 months at home with family. It was a system that kept morale high and avoided mass desertions. But the numbers don't stop there. Besides these 150,000 direct workers, there were specialized artisans, sculptors who shaped the giant cherubim, metal workers who hammered gold plates, founders who created the enormous bronze columns, carpenters who cut and adjusted the cedar beams with millimetric precision. And there were the supervisors, 3,300 men who didn't carry stone or cut wood. Their function was to organize, supervise, punish when necessary, and reward when deserved. Each supervisor controlled about 45 workers. They knew each man by name, knew their abilities, their weaknesses. If someone was absent, they were immediately replaced. If someone worked slowly, they received a warning. On the third warning came punishment. To give you an idea of the scale, imagine a packed soccer stadium. Now imagine 3 packed stadiums. That was Solomon's temple workforce. And all of them, all 150,000, worked under a single coordination, following a single plan, fulfilling a single objective. Curiosity 3, 400-ton stones, without cranes or wheels. This is, without a doubt, one of the most impressive and inexplicable curiosities of Solomon's temple. How were stone blocks weighing 400 tons cut, transported and positioned 3,000 years ago, without cranes, without metal pulleys, without appropriate wheels? 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 17 specifically mentions large stones and costly stones used in the temple's foundation. Archaeologists who studied the second temple platform, built later in the same location, found blocks weighing more than 400 tons. 400 tons! To help you understand, that's the weight of 60 adult elephants or 80 mid-sized cars. And these stones weren't close to the construction site. They were extracted from quarries in the mountains around Jerusalem, kilometers away. The process began with identifying the exact location to cut. The cutters traced lines on the rock using stones harder than limestone. Then they opened small, deep holes along these lines. Then came the ingenious part. They inserted dry wooden wedges into these holes and poured water. The wood absorbed the water and swelled. The pressure gradually increased. After hours, sometimes days, the rock cracked exactly where they had planned. Without explosives, without the noise of hammers hitting metal chisels, just the dull sound of stone splitting. But cutting was just the beginning. Transporting was where the true brutality began. They built giant ramps of compacted earth, going up and down the mountains. The stone was placed on thick tree trunks that functioned as rollers. Ropes of plant fiber, thick as human arms, were tied around the block, and then began the most brutal work of the construction, pulling. Hundreds of men held the ropes. A supervisor shouted rhythmic commands so everyone would pull at the same time. Pull! And everyone pulled. Stop! And everyone stopped. The logs that were left behind were repositioned to the front. Pull! And it started again. The stone moved centimeter by centimeter, sometimes just a few fingers at a time. A 400-ton block could take weeks to travel just 5 kilometers. During all this time, the men slept beside the stone, ate there, didn't let go until it reached its destination. And here's the detail that makes everything even more terrible. The ropes weren't eternal. Plant fibers have limits. Under constant pressure of 400 tons, they began to wear out. Threads broke one by one. And when the rope finally gave way, chaos ensued. The weight redistributed violently. Men were thrown forward. Others were trapped. The stone, out of control, sometimes slid backward, crushing whoever was in the way. There were no ambulances, no hospitals, no compensation for families. You died, and another man took your place on the rope the next day. Mortality among the carriers was the highest of the entire work. And even so, the work didn't stop, because Solomon had deadlines to meet, and the temple didn't wait for anyone. Curiosity. 4. Wood imported from another country by sea and land, Israel, didn't have the trees necessary to build Solomon's temple. Cedar, the noblest wood of the ancient world, grew only in the mountains of Lebanon. So Solomon did what any leader would do. He bought it. But what seemed simple on paper was brutally complicated in practice. The negotiation with Hiram, king of Tyre, is recorded in 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 6 to 11. Hiram would provide specialized lumberjacks and all the necessary cedar. In exchange, Israel would pay 20,000 kor of wheat per year, more than 4 million liters, and 20,000 baths of oil, another 2 million liters. It was an absurdly expensive commercial agreement, but money was the least of the problems. The real challenge was bringing thousands of cedar logs from Lebanon to Jerusalem, 200 kilometers of distance. Mountains, valleys, rivers, foreign territory. 10,000 Israelites were assigned to work in Lebanon, but in a shift system, 1 month in the forests, 2 months at home. Adoniram was the supervisor responsible for organizing this rotation. Every month, 10,000 men went up to the Lebanese mountains, worked alongside Sidonian lumberjacks, felled gigantic centuries-old cedars, cut the logs into transportable sizes. Then came the impressive logistical part, transportation in 2 stages. First stage, by sea. The logs were tied to each other, forming enormous rafts. Pushed and guided by smaller boats, these rafts floated through the Mediterranean Sea to the port of Joppa, today part of Tel Aviv. The journey took days. Storms were common. Sometimes the ropes broke and logs were lost at sea, but it was the fastest way to move heavy wood over long distances. Second stage, by land. From Joppa to Jerusalem is about 60 kilometers. Seems like little, but each cedar log weighed tons. They used the same technique as with stones, smaller logs as rollers, ropes, hundreds of men pulling. The difference is that wood is more fragile than stone. If you let the cedar drag on the ground, it scratched, cracked, lost quality. So the care had to be doubled, and the time much longer. A single log could take weeks to reach Jerusalem. The men who did this work slept in the open. They ate basic rations, bread, lentils and water. Many got sick, fevers, infections, exhaustion. There were no specialized doctors. If you got too sick to work, you were replaced. If you died, your family received the news weeks later when your shift ended and you didn't come home. It was a brutal system, but efficient. Because in the end, the cedar arrived. Each log that entered Jerusalem was one more piece of the most grandiose puzzle ever built. Curiosity 5. Built in absolute silence. This is perhaps the most surprising and incomprehensible rule of all Solomon's temple construction. No sound of iron tools could be heard at the construction site. None. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a preference. It was a direct order recorded in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7. Think about what this means in practice. How do you build a 30-meter-high building with blocks of hundreds of tons, using gigantic cedar beams, without making noise? How do you fit stone to stone without adjusting? How do you correct errors without hammering? The answer was in absolute preparation. Everything had to come out perfect from the quarries and carpentry workshops, each stone cut to the exact size, each cedar beam measured to the millimeter, each joint planned in advance. Because when the material reached Mount Moriah, where the temple was being erected, there would be no second chance. The architects and master builders used a sophisticated marking system. Symbols were engraved on the stones still in the quarries, Hebrew letters, numbers, signs that indicated the exact position of each block. When the stone arrived in Jerusalem, the builders read the marks and knew exactly where to place it. They didn't need to measure again, didn't need to adjust with chisels. They just fitted it. And if it fit wrong, then the error was back there in the quarries, and someone would be severely punished for it. The work at the site was tense, silent. Hundreds of men moving gigantic stones without being able to speak loudly, without being able to use metal tools. They used wooden levers, wedges, ropes, slow and calculated movements. A block out of place meant dismantling part of the structure and starting over. All this without hitting, without sawing, without hammering. The level of coordination required was absurd. A communication error and tons of stone fell on workers. But why did this rule exist? The explanation lies in the temple's purpose. It wasn't an ordinary palace, it was God's house, a sacred place where the Creator himself would dwell. And God had ordered that the place be treated with absolute reverence from the first day of construction. The noise of iron tools was considered profane, so the work had to be done in holiness, in silence, as if each stone placed were an act of worship. The 3,300 supervisors had the task of guaranteeing this. They circulated all the time, observed each movement, heard each sound, and at the slightest sign of disobedience, they acted. Punishments varied: whippings for light infractions, ration reduction, even heavier work. In extreme cases, expulsion from the work. For the Canaanites in forced labor, being expelled could mean prison or worse. For the Israelites in shifts, it meant public dishonor, so everyone obeyed. They worked in silence, and somehow, against all odds, the temple rose, stone by stone, without sound, without error. Curiosity. 27. Tons of pure gold on the walls. If the gigantic stones and imported wood already impress, what about the gold? 27 tons of pure gold covering interior walls. To give you a dimension, 27 tons of gold today would be worth more than $1.5 billion. And we're talking about values from 3,000 years ago. 1 Kings chapter 6 verses 20 to 22 describes how the temple's interior was covered. The oracle, the Holy of Holies, measured 9 meters in length, 9 in width, and 9 in height. Everything there was covered with pure gold, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It wasn't gold paint. It wasn't thin plating. They were plates of beaten gold nailed onto cedar. And the work of preparing these plates was brutal. Pure gold is soft, malleable. You can hammer it until it becomes thin as paper without it cracking. But this requires technique, patience, and strength. Specialized artisans heated small amounts of gold until they became soft. Then they hammered on stone anvils. They hit, turned, hit again until they got uniform, thin plates. Each plate took hours to make, and thousands of them were needed to cover all the temple's surfaces. The work didn't stop. Furnaces operated incessantly. Wood was burned in absurd quantities to maintain the necessary heat. Men worked in shifts because nobody could stand more than a few hours near the fire. Sweat poured, hands got burned, even using thick rags to hold the tools. And where did all this gold come from? From tributes, from mines controlled by Solomon, from gifts from foreign kings. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 14 says Solomon received 660 talents of gold per year. That equals more than 22 tons annually. A good part of that went directly to the temple. But gold didn't just cover walls. There were entire objects made of gold or plated in gold. Giant wooden cherubim, 4.5 meters tall, completely plated in gold. Their open wings touched the walls of the Holy of Holies. The incense altar, made entirely of gold. Tables for the bread of the presence. Various utensils, cups, snuffers, basins. Gold chains that hung lamps. The manufacture of these pieces required another level of skill. Sculptors shaped the wood. Then the metalworkers applied the gold, hammering thin sheets over the sculpted forms. They polished until there were no imperfections. It was art and engineering at the same time. And who coordinated all this? A man named Hiram, brought especially from Tyre. He wasn't an Israelite, he was Phoenician, son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and a Tyrian father. According to 1 Kings chapter 7 verses 13 and 14, he was filled with wisdom, understanding and knowledge to do all the bronze work. But bronze wasn't his only domain. Hiram also supervised the gold work, and when they finished, when the last plate was fixed, when the last object was polished, the temple was no longer just a construction. It was a marvel that reflected light like no other structure on earth. Curiosity 7. Bronze columns 8 meters tall, weighing 34 tons each. If you visit the archaeological ruins related to Solomon's temple, one of the most discussed structures are the 2 gigantic columns that stood at the entrance, Jachin and Boaz. They weren't ordinary columns, they were works of art in solid bronze that challenged everything we know about ancient metallurgy. 1 Kings chapter 7 verses 15 to 22 describes the columns in impressive detail. Height, 8 meters each, 18 cubits. Circumference, 5.5 meters, 12 cubits, which means about 1.75 meters in diameter. Estimated weight, 34 tons each of solid bronze. Capitals. On top of each column, there was a decorated capital 2.25 meters high, ornamented with pomegranates and lily-shaped work. Now the question nobody can answer easily: how do you cast 34 tons of bronze in a single piece 3,000 years ago? Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. To cast bronze, you need to reach temperatures of at least 950 degrees Celsius. And to create columns of this size, you need gigantic furnaces, perfect molds, and an absurd amount of fuel. Hiram, the master metalworker from Tyre, was responsible for this feat. He probably used the clay mold casting technique. First, they built a model of the column in wood or clay. Then they covered this model with several layers of fine clay, creating the external mold. When the clay dried and hardened, they removed the internal model and were left with a perfect hollow mold. Then came the furnaces. Multiple furnaces operated simultaneously, melting bronze in large quantities. When the metal reached the melting point, it was carefully poured into the mold. The process had to be fast because bronze cools and solidifies quickly. Any error and 34 tons of bronze became scrap. The mold could crack with the heat. The bronze could solidify before completely filling the form. Air bubbles could create fatal imperfections. But Hiram didn't make mistakes. The 2 columns came out perfect, and after casting came the finishing touches, polishing, engraving ornaments, applying decorated capitals. The columns had specific names: Jachin, which means he will establish, and Boaz, which means in him is strength. They weren't just decorative, they were symbols. They represented the firmness and strength of the temple, and by extension, the firmness and strength of God dwelling there. When you entered the temple, the first things you saw were these 2 bronze towers shining in the sun. It was a declaration of power, of wealth, of technical capability. No other nation in the ancient world had anything comparable. Curiosity 8. A bronze tank that held 40,000 liters of water. If the bronze columns were already impressive, the large bronze tank known as the Molten Sea was simply impossible to believe. Imagine a gigantic pool made of solid bronze, supported by 12 life-sized metal oxen. Sounds like fantasy, but it's recorded with precise details in 1 Kings chapter 7 verses 23 to 26. The dimensions were absurd. Diameter, 4.5 meters, 10 cubits from rim to rim. Height, 2.25 meters, 5 cubits. Circumference, 13.5 meters, 30 cubits. Wall thickness, 7.5 centimeters, a handbreadth. Capacity, 40,000 liters of water, 2,000 baths according to 1 Kings, or 3,000 baths according to Sioux Chronicles. This tank didn't have a decorative purpose. It was functional. It served for the ritual purifications of the priests. Before entering the temple or performing sacrifices, the priests needed to wash. And this gigantic tank provided enough water for hundreds of daily purifications. But here's what impresses modern engineers. How do you cast a bronze piece of this size without it cracking during cooling? Bronze expands when it heats and contracts when it cools. A piece of this dimension would have enormous internal tensions during cooling. A calculation error and the entire tank would crack. Hiram needed to know not just basic metallurgy, but also the physical properties of bronze, cooling rates, stress points. Knowledge that theoretically shouldn't exist 3,000 years ago. And there's more. The tank didn't sit on the ground. It was supported by 12 cast bronze oxen, positioned in groups of 3, each group facing a cardinal direction, north, south, east, west. Each ox was an individual work of art, also cast in bronze, also weighing tons. The base had to be strong enough to support not just the weight of the bronze, which was already enormous, but also the weight of 40,000 liters of water. Water is heavy. 1 liter weighs 1 kilo. 40,000 liters. Sunga 40 tons of water. Add that to the weight of the bronze tank itself, and you have something close to 50 or 60 total tons. And this structure didn't collapse, didn't crack, didn't give way. It stood there for decades, fulfilling its function perfectly, until Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem in the 6th century BC and destroyed everything. The Babylonians broke the Molten Sea and the bronze columns into pieces and took the metal to Babylon. According to 2 Kings, chapter 25, verses 13 to 17, they literally shattered Hiram's masterpieces because they were too large to transport whole. It was the end of a technical marvel that the ancient world had never seen equal. Curiosity. 9. A foreign specialist was hired for the metal works. Solomon was the richest and wisest king of his time. He had access to the best artisans in Israel. But when it came time to work with bronze and gold on a monumental scale, he did something surprising. He hired a foreigner. Hiram, not to be confused with the king of Tyre, who had the same name, was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and a Tyrian father. He came from Tyre, a Phoenician city famous for its artisans. According to 1 Kings chapter 7 verses 13 and 14, Hiram was filled with wisdom, understanding and knowledge to do all the bronze work. It wasn't biblical exaggeration. Hiram proved his competence in each project. He cast the 2 giant columns, Jachin and Boaz. He created the Molten Sea with the 12 bronze oxen. He manufactured 10 mobile bronze bases, each measuring 1.8 meters in length, 1.8 meters in width, and 1.35 meters in height. Each base had wheels and elaborate decorations. He made 10 bronze basins that sat on the mobile bases. He created the cauldrons, shovels, and basins used in sacrifices. He supervised the goldwork on the interior walls. In summary, Hiram was the chief metallurgy engineer of the entire project, and he wasn't an Israelite, he was Phoenician. This tells us something important about Solomon. He didn't let nationalism interfere with excellence. When he needed the best, he hired the best, regardless of origin. But this also tells us something about the Phoenicians. They were centuries ahead in metallurgy techniques. Tyre was a center of trade and manufacturing. Their artisans mastered techniques that other nations didn't know. Large-scale casting, precise bronze alloys, complex molds, refined finishes. Hiram brought this knowledge to Jerusalem, and with it, he transformed Solomon's temple into the most technologically advanced structure of its time. When foreign kings visited Jerusalem and saw the bronze columns, the molten sea, the mobile bases, they were amazed. It wasn't just religiosity, it was a demonstration of technical and economic power. And Hiram, he went down in history as the man who did the impossible in bronze. Curiosity 10. The giant cherubim, 4.5 meters tall, covered in gold. In the most sacred place of the temple, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would be kept, Solomon ordered the construction of 2 figures that to this day generate theological and artistic debates. The giant cherubim. 1 Kings chapter 6 verses 23 to 28 describes these impressive sculptures. Material, olive wood or wild olive. Height, 4.5 meters each, 10 cubits. Wingspan, 4.5 meters each wing, totaling 9 meters from tip to tip when open. Positioning, standing side by side, with the inner wings touching in the center of the Holy of Holies and the outer wings touching the walls. Finish, completely plated in pure gold. Imagine the scene. You're a priest authorized to enter the Holy of Holies. You open the door. The darkness is broken only by the faint light that enters. And then you see two colossal figures shining in gold, wings open, guarding the Ark of the Covenant. But what exactly were cherubim? The Bible describes them as angelic beings of high hierarchy, different from common angels. In Ezekiel chapter 10, they're described with 4 faces: human, lion, ox, and eagle, and multiple wings. But in 1 Kings, there's no detailed description of their faces in the temple. What we know is that sculpting pieces of this size in wood required master carpenters. Olive wood is hard, dense, difficult to work with. Each cherub was probably sculpted in sections that were later joined: the wings, the bodies, the bases. Then came the gold plating work. Artisans hammered extremely thin gold sheets over the wooden surface. The process required extreme patience. If you hit too hard, the gold tore. If you hit too softly, it didn't stick properly. Constant and uniform pressure was necessary, centimeter by centimeter, until covering every detail of the sculpture. The final result? 2 4.5-meter figures that reflected lamplight in millions of golden points. When the high priest entered once a year on the Day of Atonement, it must have been an overwhelming experience. It wasn't just art, it was visual theology. It was God's presence manifested in physical form, and these cherubim stood there during the entire existence of the first temple, more than 400 years, guarding the ark, guarding the most sacred place on earth for the Israelites, until the Babylonians invaded, burned everything, and the golden cherubim turned to smoke and ashes. Curiosity 11. A supernatural cloud filled the temple at inauguration. After 7 years of brutal work, after 150,000 men working ceaselessly, after thousands died in the quarries and transporting stones, the final moment arrived: the inauguration of Solomon's temple. The ceremony took place during the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month. All Israel gathered. Priests carried the Ark of the Covenant in solemn procession from the city of David to Mount Moriah. Multitudes accompanied, singing, playing instruments, sacrificing animals along the way. Solomon was there, the elders of Israel, the tribal leaders. Everyone witnessed when the ark was finally placed in the Holy of Holies between the 2 giant golden cherubim. And then something happened that nobody expected. 1 Kings chapter 8 verses 10 and 11 records, "When the priests withdrew from the holy place, a cloud filled the temple of the Lord. The priests could not continue their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. It wasn't ordinary fog, it wasn't incense smoke. It was something different, something dense, tangible, loaded with presence. The Bible calls it the glory of the Lord. In Hebrew, Kavod Adonai, literally the weight of God's glory. The priests, men trained to serve in the temple, accustomed to rituals, couldn't stand. The presence was overwhelming. They staggered, left, couldn't minister. Solomon realized what was happening, and instead of panic, he worshipped. 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 12 records his words, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud." It was the confirmation Solomon needed. God had accepted the temple. All the work, all the gold, all the blood shed in the quarries had been worth it. Because God was there, dwelling, not symbolically, literally, the cloud remained. And from that day on, Solomon's temple was no longer just a building. It was God's house on earth, the place where heaven and earth met, where sacrifices were offered, where sins were forgiven, where prayers were heard. Kings from distant nations came to visit, not just to see the architecture, but to witness the presence, because everyone knew that temple was different. There was something there that no other temple in the ancient world had, the glory of God. Curiosity 12. The temple cost more than any work of antiquity. When you add everything up, the gold, the silver, the bronze, the imported cedar, the salaries of 150,000 workers for 7 years, the food to feed them, the tools, the transportation, you reach an inescapable conclusion. Solomon's temple was the most expensive construction in ancient history. Let's look at the numbers recorded in the Bible. Gold, 27 tons just on the interior walls. Various objects, altar, tables, utensils, several additional tons. Estimated total, more than 30 tons of pure gold. Silver. 1 Chronicles chapter 29 mentions that David had left 3,000 talents of gold, about 100 tons, and 7,000 talents of refined silver, about 233 tons, for the temple. Solomon used part of this and added more from his own reserves. Bronze, the 2 columns, 68 tons together. The Molten Sea, estimated at more than 30 tons. 10 mobile bases with their basins, several tons each. Various utensils, additional tons. Estimated total, more than 150 tons of bronze cedar of Lebanon. Thousands of imported logs, annual cost, 20,000 kor of wheat, 4 million litres, and 20,000 baths of oil, 2 million litres. During 7 years of construction, astronomical totals, workforce, 150,000 workers for 7 years. Daily feeding, bread, lentils, water, occasionally meat. 2. Feed 150,000 men for 1 day, you need tons of food. Multiply by 2,555 days of construction. Modern economists have tried to calculate the total cost of Solomon's temple in current values. Estimates vary enormously, but most fall between $5 and $10 billion. Some suggest even more. For comparison, the Egyptian pyramids cost less, mainly because they used slave labor without payment. The Roman Colosseum cost less. The Great Wall of China, built over centuries, might rival it, but it's difficult to compare. Solomon's temple was a unique project. It wasn't built to last centuries as an architectural work, although it lasted more than 400 years. It was built to be God's dwelling, and for that, no cost was too high. 1 Chronicles chapter 29 verses 1 to 5 records David explaining to Solomon why cost didn't matter. The work is great, for the palace is not for man, but for the Lord God. That was the mentality. You don't economize when you're building for God. You use the best gold, the best cedar, the best artisans. You import from other countries if necessary. You work 7 years without stopping. You invest everything. And Solomon invested. He used all the wealth that David had accumulated. He added his own colossal riches. He contracted commercial debts with neighboring nations, but in the end, he delivered the most magnificent temple the world had ever seen. When it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, it was a tragedy not just religious, but also cultural and economic. The value in gold, silver, and bronze taken to Babylon was enough to finance entire armies for years. But the true value wasn't in the metal, it was in the meaning. Solomon's temple represented God's presence with his people, and that's priceless. Conclusion: what Solomon's temple teaches us today. Solomon's temple no longer exists. It was destroyed more than 2,500 years ago. The giant stones were broken, the gold was looted, the cedar was burned, the cherubim turned to ashes, but the legacy remains. Because Solomon's temple wasn't just about architecture or engineering, it was about what's possible when you have 1. Clear purpose. Solomon wasn't building a monument to himself, he was building God's house. When you have a purpose greater than yourself, obstacles become smaller. 2. Meticulous planning. Each stone marked in the quarries, each cedar beam measured to the millimeter, each gold plate planned in advance. Nothing was improvised, everything was calculated. 3. Impeccable coordination. 150,000 workers, 3,300 supervisors, 550 chiefs. A clear hierarchy where everyone knew their role. Without this, it would have been chaos. 4. Excellence without compromise. Solomon hired the best metal worker from Tyre. He imported the best cedar from Lebanon. He used the purest gold. He didn't accept second-best options. 5. Brutal persistence, 7 years without stopping. Men died, ropes broke, stones fell, but the work continued, day after day, until finished. These lessons transcend time and religion. They apply to any great project, any great dream, any great goal you have in life. Do you have a purpose that's worthwhile, something greater than yourself? Then plan meticulously. Coordinate with excellence. Don't compromise quality, and persist no matter how many ropes break along the way. Because if 150,000 men 3,000 years ago managed to erect the impossible using only ropes, wood, and determination, what can you build with all the tools and knowledge we have today? Solomon's temple challenges us, inspires us, and reminds us that the impossible is just a matter of perspective. For those willing to pay the price, to work 7 years without ceasing, to not accept less than excellence, there is no impossible. There is only what hasn't been done yet. If you enjoyed this content, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. See you in the next video.